Hola, hola, hola.
Ahora sí.
Fíjate esto si lo podés subir, el del medio. Está
Ahí
arriba.
está. Bueno, buenas tardes a todas, buenas tardes a todos. Les quiero dar la bienvenida a una nueva reunión.
We apologize, but we cannot hear the speaker. The speaker is completely inaudible.
Por los parlamentos latinoamericanos, por el Parlacén.
We're sorry, but we cannot hear the speaker. We're representing women from this four parliament. The co-chair, my colleague, Samira Rafaela, represents the European Parliament. This forum has a dynamic like Eurolat has. Working in a way that mirrors the work done by parliamentarians in Europe with citizens on that continent and on Latin America. Today will be a very intensive working day, and I'd like to invite Ms. Restaurant and Ms. Bianca, if they could come a little closer. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Do we not have nameplates? Yes, they're here. If they could come closer. We're putting the nameplates down. So we're a panel of distinguished women who are leaders, who are activists, who are workers, and who are striving for women's rights. We, just like Samira, wanted to call us together to work on a sector having to do with sexual and reproductive rights for women. And the idea of this meeting, first I should say there will be interpretation in Spanish, English, Portuguese, and German. And for the reasons also related to interpretation, there is a time limit on the forum, and we'll need to try to work as effectively and efficiently as possible so as to finish the agenda we have set forth. And also to have a fluid and effective debate. We will have a time limit for each panelist. In the order that my colleague Samira will define. And we should remind you that for reasons of, again, linked to interpretation, you need to make yourself known at the very outset because we do not have unlimited possibilities for interpreted time. When you take the floor, my colleague Samira Rafael will be the first to speak. Welcome to Argentina. Welcome to this country, which is so generous with its visitors. I think that we've already had several working days in Eurolat and in the committees and with very intense discussions. We also had our inauguration today with Vice President Christina Kirchner, which was very interesting. And so I guess we can now consider that the Eurolat Assembly has been officially inaugurated. Tomorrow we'll have a plenary in our National Congress, where the work that we are doing in this forum with Samira and our whole team will come back to the plenary, where all the parliamentarians come together from Europe and from Latin America. And all those who are present will be able to vote on this work, which has been done on the result of the COVID pandemic for women. Welcome, Samira. Many thanks, Ophelia. It's an honor to be able to be here with you. Sexual and reproductive rights of women are a basic human right. Countries need to respect protect, and satisfy sexual and reproductive health of women. However, women continue to have their access to sexual health services made difficult, although they have a right to it. And this is an issue of human rights. These are violations which can take on many different forms. For instance, denying access to sexual and reproductive health services, including safe abortions. Low quality of services when there is access to them. Problems with women's access to services or authorization by third parties. Forced sterilization. Virginity examinations that are forcible or forced abortion without the consent of the women concerned. FGM and early marriage, forced early marriage. We as women and politicians are obliged to work ever more to create a system which will guarantee and respect those basic rights. There are people, conservatives, who are trying to undermine women's capacity to act. And I think this is happening on my own continent, in Europe, but this tendency is a universal one. And I think stretches from Texas to Poland. There are also inspiring stories, however, as we see in Chile, where the right to abortion may be part of the new constitution. In Ireland, where activists worked unceasingly to legalize abortion. And here in Argentina, activists have focused on the not one single one less, ni una menos, an anti-femicide campaign. I'd like to hear our presenters talk about this in more detail. We've seen that there is determination to act on behalf of women. Because here we're talking about self-determination of half of the world's population. That's what's at stake here. For women and for girls, there must be a universal right to make their own decisions about their bodies and about their future. To debate this at greater length, it's an honor to have with us here today all of our invited presenters. And I should like to thank the invited speakers for being here with us. And I shall give the floor for 5 minutes each to each of our guest speakers. Fernando Hilasano. Who is a director at UNESCO. Do please excuse us, but Fernando had trouble with the traffic and has just gotten here. Welcome, Fernando. Shall I forge on? Charity America Francisco, who is president of the Curaçao Parliament. Marahana Carvajal, who is a journalist. Eugenia Calafaco, national senator. Maria Luisa Storani, who is a deputy parlour, Robert Bianco, who is a researcher on women's issues in Argentina, Veronica Barrett, who also works with women's issues, Natalia Gerardi, from the Latin American team on justice and gender in Argentina. And before we begin, I'd like to announce that there have been 2 changes in the speakers list as against the agenda that you received in your file. Minister Gomez Alcorta had to cancel her participation, and Ms. Nuba Bayasa from UN Women will be replaced by Veronica Barrett. I hope my Spanish was clear to you. Many thanks. Samira made a great effort to speak Spanish, and we thank you very much for that. And I will now invite Fernando Hilasano, who is also a parliamentarian and today works in a director's role at UNESCO. Fernando, please. Hello. Many thanks to Eurolat. I still feel like I'm a bit a part of everything that the Parliament does in Mercosur. It was hard for me to leave, but I was called on to do another job. And I thank you all very much for this invitation. Do please excuse me for entering in such a disorderly way, but it's just impossible to move around in Nigeria. I live in a place called Tandaro, between trees and water, theoretically only 15 minutes away from here, and it took me an hour in my car. I ended up running the last part, and unfortunately the city is like that. I expect that there are others that are like this too, but that's how things are here. Health and sexual and reproductive rights. Let me first of all present the place in which I now work. And after that, tell you about a few things which I think could be a contribution UNESCO might make, and the center that I am presently directing could be involved in. The International Center for the Promotion of Human Rights in UNESCO, which is presently something I am lucky and honored to be leading, was founded as the first Category 2 center of UNESCO in the world dedicated to promoting human rights. It was the result of an agreement between UNESCO and the Argentine government, and it works in Buenos Aires as a decentralized body under the authority of UNESCO. Its activities are managed on the basis of international standards with the main goal of promoting deepening of the democratic system, consolidation of human rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and also the prevalence of values of life, freedom and human dignity. All that being said, the relation between the debate we're having today and human rights is direct and clear. Education is the main key that opens doors to all the possibilities to make progress in this subject, and in other areas as well, where we see that the history of activism for human rights, and especially feminist history, many people know that these have been promoted in the different places that have been occupied in civil society and in homes. Reproductive and sexual rights attempt to make it possible for people to make their own decisions on their sexual and reproductive life, knowing what possibilities they have, and so that women may have the possibility to act on an informed basis on sexuality in its full range of meanings, including gender orientation, reproduction, health, and for each person to be able to deal with things in terms of their cultural and political background and beliefs. And this is an important point. Education in this context is access to being able to make healthier and more informed decisions. And here I would like to tell you that UNESCO has worked out a technical report in October 2019, which talks about from ideas to action, dealing with the barriers to implementation, to integrating sexual and reproductive rights. And the consensus of this research has been done in 4 countries, Peru, Guatemala, Kenya, and Ghana. UNESCO has, let's say, a very strong mission in doing comparative studies that include South-South orientation in particular. And they present recommendations so as to overcome situations which are like a bottleneck and which are shared by the different countries in the lower and middle income category, and whose implementation is recognized as being important in terms of sexual and reproductive rights education. And I think this is something interesting to share with you today. Initially, sexual education is important both from a standpoint of public health and also human rights. In our country, starting with the constitutional reform of 1994, different conventions were taken on board into our Constitution. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Convention set out the Convention on Children's Rights are antecedents to our law which protects sexual and reproductive rights. And what happens in school is a fundamental component of preparing children and teenagers to their healthy and full sexual and reproductive life. And in that context, ICP can help children and adolescents with information that they need so as to protect and make safe decisions which are informed about their relationships, their choices, their health, and their sexual behavior. That means basically the key is education, as I said. It's the key that opens all doors. Without knowledge, there cannot be free choice or full exercise of one's rights. The translation of these into practice may be complex, and there are a variety of bottlenecks which may arise that prevent an effective implementation of these programs for sex education in schools, among inter alia. To that end, the document which covers from ideas to action tries to give some recommendations so that this type of problem will no longer arise. In promoting focus on participation, involving interaction with parents, guaranteeing access and use of study plans, and to have resources in schools is of critical importance for UNESCO that predetermines implementation in this field. Training and monitoring as well to make sure that these skill areas are available to teachers, and so they may have something to fall back on when problems arise. Properly trained teachers are the very backbone of a successful program, and their preparation is indispensable. The whole educational community needs to be involved. And valuable evidence shows that public attitudes concerning sex education in schools in many parts of the world are favorable. Families, teachers, local leaders recognize the importance of supporting students so that they can learn more about preventing pregnancy, MSTs, and gender-based violence. The governance commitment in particular in public policy is what makes acceleration possible and incarnates the values we are attempting to transmit. Among other things that allow us to have successful implementation and to give a greater impact, we see at different operational levels in the educational system, and each influences the other. Classrooms, schools, the national level, the local level. We need to get rid of bottlenecks which may happen at any level, and our idea is indispensable here. It is the most important thing is to see the monitoring function, not simply implementing our program, but to have continual monitoring of it so as to be able to detect at what level and where a problem might actually exist. So let me repeat that education is the key. It is the most important and most necessary investment that governments can make at this point in time. Receiving information in simple and clear language to be listened to in a non-conflictual context, to have adults who are ready to support the process, to get high-quality health care, whatever decision may be made, not to be judged. These are all important things for sexual and reproductive rights succeed in education and in culture and give fuller freedom to which our democracies all aspire. Thank you very much. I'd also like to share this study with you that I will leave here and this recommendation, which seems to me to be important. There are many more details of things to say, but I have understand that we have strict time limits. Thank you very much. Many thanks, Fernanda. And thank you for sticking to the time as well, so thanks for that as well. Let me now invite the President of the Curaçao Parliament, Ms. Veronica Francisca. Please, you have the floor, madam.
Gracias.
Thank you. And a very good afternoon, or as we say in Curaçao, boa tarde. For me, it's an honor to be here in my first Eurolat meeting, but also to be able to say a few words to you, to women who are making a difference in your respective areas of authority. These last few years were very important for shared topics between women, but which are not necessarily visible to others. Subjects which in my previous work in doing family counseling periodically required my attention. Subjects of domestic abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, subjects of lack of safety created by toxic environments and dysfunctional relationships. My entry into the political arena was motivated by a deep desire to empower other women not to have to look elsewhere for something they already have within themselves. For me, empowering means discovering potential that every one of us has inside. Perhaps it's not visible at first glance, but with a Google click, you'll discover that I've been married for 22 years with the love of my life, that we have 5 children, and my oldest daughter has just turned 20 last week. My oldest daughter, Abigail, is a coffee-colored girl, very intelligent, studying and living in the Netherlands with very strong self-esteem. My daughter, my oldest daughter, Abigail, has decided to take control of her own destiny and not to be a victim of what the world dictates to women. And she was engendered with love. She was educated by her family to overcome her vulnerability to be victorious. And Google as well will tell you that today is my birthday and that I like taking pictures with my family. But that's what we're coming to. We're not here because we're unaware of the power that women have. We're not here because someone gave us permission. We're not here either trying to prove something which is natural and proper. A world without women is a world without life. A world without women is a chaotic world. Dear friends, we are here so that some structures and laws that govern us were designed in times that we're not aware of women's true role. And these are the structures that prevent women discover their own potential. My greatest ambition as a politician is to identify the next generation of women with the idea of empowering them. Allow me to share 3 points with you that we might apply now so as to empower the coming generation. Let us lend our voices and platform to women who are still victims just because they're women. For instance, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we need not only to condemn the war, using all the resources at our disposal to identify crimes against women and to ensure that these will not remain unpunished. With horror, I heard yesterday recordings that had been intercepted of Russian women giving permission to their boyfriends sexually to abuse women in Ukraine. With horror, I was not simply thinking about Ukrainian women, but also because I was aware of the subject of mental abuse in dysfunctional relationships, which can lead to a woman losing empathy with other women. Let us identify laws that reduce women to a status of objects or other people's property, and let us cooperate with legislators so that these laws are relegated to the history books as examples of uncivilized societies. We have the ability to do this, and together we can accelerate this process throughout the world. Finally, let us practice what we preach. Our children learn more from what I say than what I do. From what I do than what I say. A successful woman anywhere in the world is a victory for all women. There is no more toxic form of resistance to women's progress than enmity between women. Let us have the necessary impact so that we can celebrate each and every one of our achievements. The COVID pandemic in these last years has exposed conditions which had already existed for a long time. Abuse against women in Curaçao increased during the pandemic. Our Office for Aid to Victims indicate that many women are frightened to express themselves and do not wish to denounce their aggressors. It is my opinion that this is also something that happens throughout the world. We have work to do, and we have the will to do it. God bless us always, and let us go on expanding His room and His influence. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Francisca, and very happy birthday to you. I should now like to introduce our next speaker. Is the youngest senator in the history of the Argentine Senate from San Luis, and is also a chair of a committee in the Senate. And it's Eugenia Caltalfama.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Julia, and good afternoon to everyone. It is an enormous pleasure and honor to be a part of this meeting today here at Eurolat, to be able to listen to the other panelists and to learn from you, and to contribute to a number of different subjects that are something that will lead us to equal opportunities and treatment for women around the world. My name is Julia already presented me, and I'm from San Luis in the center of my country, and I'm a part of the Women's Bank, which is so important and challenging, where we debate rights of women and diversity in our country. Now, we're speaking specifically about sexual rights and health today, and so I was pleased to be a part of this debate because I'm young. I'm a feminist, I'm an activist, and every day we can see that society tries to sap the sexual reproductive rights of women. And on a daily basis, we have to fight to make sure that enough attention is being paid to the laws that exist in our country. Some of these laws, for example, request a correct implementation, and that will mean that there will be a before and after that might ensconce some violent patterns in our country. Now, when we talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights, we're talking about basic rights, for example, a right to health, a right to life, or the right to all of these fundamental rights that are linked amongst themselves. Now, sexual rights are ones that come down to the right to choice, a free choice with whom, when, and how to have sexual relations without any pressure, without any violence, with respect for our sexual orientation, with respect to our specific gender, and having good information, as well as being able to make choices about our bodies and living and experiencing our sexual life without any violence and freely. So there are many things have been fought for and have been gained, but nonetheless we have much that remains to be done. There's much discrimination and violence against women on a daily basis. For example, the use of women's bodies in media and in advertisement, as well as those who are subjected to gender violence on TV shows, as well as some representatives of the country even undermine our sexual rights and prevent us from being able to really enjoy them fully. In 2015, one of the greatest movements, most wonderful movements began, and that really started a before and an after to more empowerment for women. It was essentially groups and communities of feminist organizations and women that opened doors to say enough, enough. And it turned the corner on silence that had been maintained for so long, where women started to talk about the violence, the dramatic cases of violence that they had experienced on a daily basis. And then there were communities of women that assisted those victims. And also, altogether, we were able to better understand that guilt does not lie with the victim, as often it seems to be the case, but rather with the attacker. And it's something that comes down to men, and we should have a fulfilled life without violence. It's not always easy, but what we do know is that, and this is a fact, is that women are not going to turn away from standing up for this right. And when you look at justice, the way that it is meted out is sometimes different, and there can be cases of silencing victims to be able to preserve these pacts that exist between violent men and that are educated under the same rules and norms under which we are educated. And as we make progress with rights and more struggle that we carry out, it seems that there is less being done on the other side. And so yes, we have to all together work to make sure that we can aim for that equality that we are seeking so desperately, and that we deserve, and that the women of my country deserve. I think it is absolutely fundamental, and I wanted to really raise this point in the panel. Argentina absolutely needs a feminist reform of the justice system that looks at the gender aspect all the way up through the highest courts. The Supreme Court at this time does not have a single justice sitting on the bench, and this needs to change for our daughters. And there are laws that are being passed. Were there a justice system to be able to exist gender-free with no discrimination, and that repudiates acts of violence, it's absolutely going to be justice and the press that at times questions the word of the victim, the role that the government needs to play in not all of this, and we mentioned that before. The government needs to absolutely disarm some of these violent patterns that exist in our society. Now, not just from the school age, but all the way back to the home, so that we don't continue these patterns with young boys all the way up through to men. And our feminist reality needs to raise the visibility of, often raises the visibility of certain aspects of women, but I think that the key really is less violence. Since 2006, we have the sexual education law in schools, and that, as our colleague mentioned, and it looks to try to look at sexuality as a right, and it encourages gender equality, intergenerational dialogue, as well as a positive way of looking at sexuality. All of this assists, hopefully, to reduce levels of violence and increase access to contraception. Now, what we've seen is that when the education comes to teachers and schools, that brings about enormous and profound change in society. The problem is that when you have any law that broadens rights, that means that there is something that has been acquired and conquered, and then there's always a little bit of resistance to that. And so this is the case here too. So we'll need also, we're going to have those who will run counter to those great gains and rights. It comes to our young people that look for the direct and immediate implementation of that law, as well as the law for abortion. And that makes a huge change in sexual education in school. We've seen that there have been steps forward to marriage for all in 2020, but in 2018 it wasn't passed, and unfortunately I think there's not much left. And then when it comes to abortion, we can see from the elderly to the young women, the entire women's community in every area of our country have been working to make sure that this right is fully upheld. Now, I was one of those members of the legislature in 2018. I was oscillating between for or against, and perhaps because of the family that raised me, or because I was expecting my daughter at the time, and therefore perhaps that influenced me. But at the debate, we could hear the women's fight every day, and I listened to people in the streets, and it changed my opinion, and now I am a firm believer and defender of freedom and our freedom to choose for our bodies. Then the national government discussed this law, then adopted it, along with the organizations in the various provinces. We have now moved into the next phase. Now let us just hope that this will be fully implemented and applied in such a way that in every corner of the country, women's and that those who would need this right can access that right. We need to also close the gap amongst the various provinces. There are some provinces that have made great progress in this subject matter in terms of services. Others lag behind, and we can see that comes down very much to the healthcare professionals that are there too. The UN and the way that it is looked at sexual and reproductive health and rights, we can see that in terms of the percentage of pregnancies around the world, in 2019, 6 of every 10 adolescents had birth in public hospitals. It stated that they had not chosen to have that child. Now, this is a part of one of the many sexual and reproductive health rights. So this being the year of women, I think that over the course of the time we're going to be working on a subject that is of utmost importance, menstrual health and menstrual justice, because that also creates inequalities amongst with women and during their menstrual cycle, and that would help to close the gender gap. One last thing, I think that it's so important is that when it comes to sexual and reproductive rights and health, by not upholding them, that is a violence against women. And as legislators of our countries, we have to place the focus and fight for a fairer and society that acts in solidarity with others. And we should be proud as women leaders to be able to continue the path forward to the benefit of future generations. Thank you very much.
Eugenia.
Thank you very much. Eugenia was saying that we mustn't hesitate to speak at any time, and I know that the next speaker will feel fully free to speak, and we are happy to hear Mariana Carvajal, who is a journalist. She wrote a book. She also speaks much on this subject. Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Ahí. Bueno, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Julia, for having invited me this afternoon. It is a true honor to be a part of this debate and this space for reflection in terms of what we have achieved and what we still need to achieve, and the possibility to choose and to craft a public policy, to vote on it in our parliaments. So there are really some areas of light and some areas of shade when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights. For example, progress has been made in terms of abortion. And then there was the decriminalization in Colombia recently, in September of 2021 in Mexico too, where the highest court stated that it's unconstitutional to criminalize women or those who contribute to abortion all the way up to week 12, meaning that you cannot bring about any legal proceedings in Mexico for this. And then Uruguay in Puerto Rico, amongst others. Now we know that there are still some extremely serious situations. The overwhelming majority of women in our regions cannot freely decide things related to their bodies. They cannot decide freely about their body. This criminalization of abortion is still very much in place, still in one country, and there's been violence in OBGYN care with sometimes even 20 or 30 years in prison. And so Julia said that I worked on a film which will be shown here. It talks about the right to abortion in El Salvador, which is the one country where there is still fully criminalized, and it has a huge impact on the rights of women and children. But not just in El Salvador, where abortion is penalized or is criminalized fully. In Nicaragua, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic, and Haiti too. There are no exceptions for this. In El Salvador, for example, you can't even carry out an abortion for a pregnancy that is outside of the uterus, and the doctor cannot make a request, even if it were to. The woman's life would be at risk. Even if the woman would like to terminate the pregnancy, they still have to maintain the pregnancy. Otherwise, they can be prosecuted criminally. Now, there are other cases that are less extreme, but that still trample on rights. For example, in Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and in these countries, there is a decriminalization of abortion only if the mother's life is at risk, and sometimes it cannot even, and that's when the woman's life is at risk. But there are nuances, and the Constitutional Court, as well as the Assembly, debated this and allowed abortion for those who have been subjected to sexual violence, but with some exceptions. So there are these really strong opponents that are working and that are accessing our parliaments and having an influence on policy. Minors and in indigenous populations can abort all the way up until the 18th week, but in other cases there are, and that the date is earlier than that. And this is in the case of violence, sexual violence, when sexual violence has been involved. Now, kids, we know it often takes a lot longer to realize that the child is pregnant and that the violence has taken place, because it frequently is molestation within the family. In Chile, also, they're undertaking a reform where there have been cases against the use of abortion. Now, when it comes to forced pregnancy of children and teenagers, this is really a tragedy in the region. something that's very much comparable to torture. In Argentina, we have a legislative framework which is sophisticated. We were a beacon for the women and feminists movements for these rights, which aim to bring about reforms that have taken place over the course of the last decade, as mentioned by the senator. More than 3,000 children under the age of 14 become mothers. And we believe that the overwhelming majority are because of sexual abuse. In Bolivia, to give you some statistics, in 2021, 230,000 under 15 gave birth. Now, abortion is legal for them, but often they don't realize that they're pregnant early enough. They don't realize that they are pregnant early enough because of the family context, usually where the abuse is taking place, and that means that it's harder to get access to an abortion, even in places where abortion is legal. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of parliamentary initiatives that are of concern. In Peru, in the Congress, there is a draft bill of one member, and it recognized the rights of the fetus and protection of the fetus from conception. In Guatemala, there have been several draft bills also that run counter to sexual rights, sexual and reproductive rights, and against trans and other communities. And then a number have been discussed in Chile as well. A conservative member of parliament came forward with an initiative that is a draft bill that was would declare the 9th of March as the Day of the Family, and would then try to underscore respect for the family, and family, i.e. no abortion. So restricting sexual and reproductive health and rights, and preventing abortion of young people, teenagers, and those who have been subjected to sexual violence. Now, there are other initiatives that try to make trans people invisible. For example, in Peru, another draft was put forth by the same member of parliament that would protect girls against any type of disturbance in terms of their gender identity. And in the Congress, this was sent to the floor of the plenary for the debate at some point. Now, one of the aspects of this initiative is they're looking for non-binary and trans people would be considered as someone with a disturbance, and that would therefore prevent the recognition of their rights, and sanctions or penalties against organizations that use any type of material to assist non-binary and trans communities. So these are just a few examples of things that are taking place in our parliaments in the region. Now, I said at the beginning there are breakthroughs, but there are also some things that are of concern, and alliances that are against rights that are formed between civil society, politicians, as well as those in the justice, and they're actually trying to backtrack on the progress that we have made. And so as we make progress, then there will be further sapping of rights along the way, and I don't think we can allow that to happen. Thank you very much.
Mariana Carvajal.
Thank you very much, Mariana Carvajal. Maria Storani is a recognized feminist who's always fought for women's rights and was a member of the civic movement and radical movement and a part of Parla Sur. The floor is yours, Maria Luisa. We're happy to listen to you. Hello, thank you, Julia. Thank you to the European Parliament for this invitation to be able to speak to you, to share with you in this day. And I apologize because my voice is a little hoarse. Now, I wanted to specifically link up to the fight with women and children in Ukraine who have seen all of their rights infringed. and there was an announcement from the UN speaking out against the violations of women and children in Bucha and other places of Ukraine, because I must express my solidarity, because I don't think in a debate of this type where we're talking about women and suffering, we shan't forget the women of Ukraine. Now, I knew that there were going to be a number of experts on this panel here, and we're all sharing in this discussion, taking the subject of fighting for the rights of sexual and reproductive health. One of the issues was gender identity and marriage for all. The feminist movement in Argentina has been working for many years, and one of the great achievements that they made was the law that meant that women could have transversal relations, and that changed the agenda in terms of gender issues. Now we have this law of equality through the passing of this law, and there's been a solidification of feminism in Argentina. We were able to have a cross-cutting alliances in terms of activism of the various movements of women in Argentina. I think that's something that really differentiates us from the situation in other countries. We suffered for many years for the violation of our rights. We lost all of our rights because of the military dictatorship in Argentina. And following that, we had to work to get our rights recognized, and we had the right of divorce as well. And with this alliance, as well as with this organized movement, we had a recognition of our rights of sexual and reproductive health. In addition, with the law that was put forth at the time, that would have changed the criminal code to decriminalize abortion, but we weren't able to achieve that. But the member who brought that bill forward, people from the church came and spoke out against her, using horrible words against her. And we will never forget that horrible moment. It sent us back many years. But in 2015 and in 2018, with the enormous movement for abortion, in 2010 we had marriage equality. And that was a huge breakthrough, because what needed to be changed in the civil code was just one letter, one word. Instead of saying marriage between men and women, it was a marriage between two individuals. And so it really changed so much, and yet it was just one word that was changed, where there was a huge shift in terms of the conservative approach, as well as those working for gay rights, where you saw there was everyone was listening to every organization. And of course, the detractors were extremely well organized to be able to speak out against the draft bill, but civil society was really well organized. And the Federation of Gays and Lesbians and many other organizations in Argentina worked so hard in outreach to campaign with every single member of parliament, where there was about a year of debate, and there was a constant discussion on any of the questions that the member of parliament might have, or what things might concern them. And at that time, one of the big concerns was, and it was actually said, it was really awful, they were saying how they were going to be able to, how these couples would be able to adopt. How were they going to be able to have children in these types of couples? And it just showed how much ignorance there was, because we know there was a prohibition of adoption. It said nothing about the fact that the couple needed to be of the same gender. And so this was discussed in the Chamber of Deputies along these lines. I think that this was one of the important points of the strength of organized civil society, that they required the chamber to take up this issue and to address it. And at that time, I was a member of the parliament, so I was so lucky to have been there. There are a lot of legislators here in the room that were a part of this debate at the time. But the chamber was a chamber of individuals of 50 years of age. 50 years of age with the federal representation in this country, where there are some provinces that are highly conservative. And many of them were saying to us as legislators, we will not be able to, you can't adopt this law because the bishop in your village will not accept this. But then on Sunday, we would see that young people were turning out to try to convince that the law be adopted. The vote was really close in the Senate, but it passed. And this was a right that is now been acquired in Argentina. In 2020, we know 31 countries in the world that have approved a gay marriage law, and we were one of the first in Latin America, and the second in the Americas, just following Canada. Now, I'm not sure if you'll recall, but at the time they were saying it would be better to just have a civil civil union instead of having a marriage or having the right to marriage. Why shouldn't there be access to the same rights? Because everyone is born the same in the eyes of the law. But we have to recognize the fact that that is not the case, and that you actually have to fight to make sure that the treatment is equal before the law. There were so many demonstrations at the time, organizations for human rights, the ECJ in 2018, as well as the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. There was an amicus brief in which they said that equal marriage for all is something that is a human right, and that already in 2018. And then almost immediately we had this debate on gender identity. We were also pioneers here. This was an intense debate indeed, where we recognize the fact that an individual can identify in the way that they want to identify, with the gender they identify, and can change their name in their documents. But more important of that in this law, I think, is the most important of this law is there's the article in the health plan, the mandatory health plan. You factor in the right to be able to have free access to healthcare, because what you'll know is that the life expectancy of trans in Argentina is 35 of age, and in fact need healthcare at a much younger age. So this was a huge advance for us. Now we have to look at how can we make sure that this is actually and fully implemented, because it's one thing to talk about Buenos Aires and the greater Buenos Aires region, but what about in the rural areas? Rural areas where you can see that inequality is much greater and that the services are not prepared and poised to assist these people. What we have to do is make sure that we have services that are open and amenable to these individuals. I'm not sure how I'm doing on my speaking time, but let's say that in our fight for sexual and reproductive health and rights, these were things that were great breakthroughs that place us in a position in the world that would really place us in the first world. That's how I would like to put it. Thank you.
Gracias, María Luisa Storani.
Thank you so much, Maria Luisa Storani. I should say that I'm very proud to have been in the Parliament when these two laws were approved, and I was able to vote for both of them. I don't know if Maria Luisa will recall that. Now we have Mabel Bianco, who is also a feminist leader, well recognized in Argentina and in United Nations institutions and in other organizations as well. So it's a pleasure for us to listen to what she has to say. Many thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this invitation. And as one of the people of longest standing in this struggle, I might be the most senior of all here. I'm very proud of saying that this was a defense of sexual and reproductive rights was the fight which guided me from a time when I was very young, and I'm a doctor, and already when I was at medical school I started. But I've followed this line because the fight for these rights always seemed to me the most important thing to fight and to go into further depth on. There's a couple of things I'd like to say. I don't know how orderly my presentation is going to be, but first of all to say that feminists in this country weren't well considered. And only when we were able to exit the dictatorship, then suddenly we flowered. It's as if we hadn't been here at all before. It's just people weren't concerned with rights, and when that happened, which was the case before, then women's rights can't be respected either when rights in general aren't being respected. So it's quite clear that in countries where you don't have full human rights, we need for these problems to be overcome so that women's rights may prevail. And this is a very basic principle, and I think all legislators know this, but it does no harm to recall that. Then secondly, in this country, there was a pro-natalist possibly, because it's a big country with lots of geographic area and not much population, but those pro-natalist possibilities led people to negate the right of persons and of couples to decide when, how, with whom, etc. We're not talking about having sexual relations, of having children. And we, exactly the opposite of what happened in some other countries, we were the countries that didn't have birth control because laws didn't talk about it. Because we were supposed to have a population growing. It was a demographic principle. We were not supposed to ever mention this, but it was clearly there. And so when I started working in the first conference, an international population and development conference, for us, feminists from this region and from this country, it was a very important fight because we were able to talk for the first time about rights that would break away from that situation with demographic targets, population targets. That was one of the problems that we had. And that was in Cairo. And we managed to bring about recognition of reproductive rights. We weren't able to make progress about sexual rights yet, but we needed to work on the subject of reproductive rights, folding sexual rights into those. But then, in the following year, in Beijing, we managed to directly address sexual rights as well, which we didn't think we were going to be able to do, to tell you the truth. It seemed quite impossible, but it went very well. And this, I think, is how, starting in Beijing, we really had a full landscape, a full image of what sexual and reproductive rights mean. And it's a whole set of factors in which we're not just talking about access to information and methods for family planning. It's much, much more than that. And for that reason, we talk about the whole. And this integral approach means that several things have to happen. First of all, full sexual education. That was the motto of our pro-abortion campaign, full sexual education. Secondly, access to birth control methods so as not to have to abort. And that was the Sexual and Reproductive Health Law, which took us 10 years. From 1990 to 2002, we had to fight for that law. There were drafts that came out. Some were better, some were worse. We won somewhat, we lost some others. We saw these things be born and die. And the Senate was the place where people didn't even dare to vote on this because of the pressure from conservative forces in each province that was represented, sometimes even more clearly by religious groups, but not only by them. And this is something we need to recognize. Our establishment is, or was, I hope that things have changed now, an extremely conservative one, and didn't accept us. So, in 2002, finally, the stars aligned and we were able to get this done because there were three main things that happened. The first basic thing was that in this country, people discovered women's mortality, mother's mortality, and infant mortality. I'm a doctor, this was nothing new, but in 2001, 2002, they discovered that in Tucumán, for instance, we knew this, the Vox Populi knew this, but people discovered this. So it was in the media every day, and that obviously contributed to consciousness raising. Then the second subject was, for the first time, we had this law of quotas of women's participation on electoral lists. We didn't have that before. And in 2001, because of the work that had been done by the Women's Council, and at that time, Cámara chaired that. She was Maria Luisa's sister. And a decree was prepared which included a quota for women in the Senate, because that meant that the first time elections were going to be able to 3 senators, because our electoral system, as in other places, was only with 2. And then we had a majority, and we managed to have a 3rd senator for the minority. And so the decree, therefore, considered that each party had to have at least 1 woman. And since at that time, in 2002, for the first time, we had almost 40% of women in the Senate. And those women could not just go back to our provinces and said, we voted against this draft law on sexual and reproductive rights, because other women would have killed them. And then the third thing was that we had a minister at that time, Inés González Garcia, who supported this. I think lots of praise for the fight and the opposition they had to face up to it. And this wasn't really a political position, because someone who came from public health, we had worked there together, and who knew that this was a reality we had to come to grips with. And that allowed us to have this law finally passed in 2002. But at that point, we were not able to have universal sexual education, only in public schools, 50%. And then secondly, if you can just give me 1 minute more, and then I'll finish. Secondly, we couldn't have surgical birth control methods. So, to explain all of this to our feminists, this was the law that we had to prove, that we had to support as feminists, because it was a beginning. And then 4 years later, we had a law on full sexual education and a law on surgical birth control methods. But we had lots and lots of other things happen, one of which was the subject of abortion. Maria Luisa said earlier how strong the struggle had been for equal marriage. And I would like to say even more the law for identity. And I would ask the members of parliament who are here, especially from Latin America, that they please fight for this. This is the thing of the most basic importance of all, even more than the law for equal marriage, because it is what allows people to have their own identity, which is the most fundamental thing. And this we did manage to have, but we still didn't manage to get abortion approved, and people consider abortion. And that happened to the majority of political parties. They didn't want to grant people abortion because that was for women and it was going to bring about a revolution. And that was the fight that had to go on and on and on, because laws are not enough. We need to change values, and when values change, that takes a lot of work. And that has to do with education, and not only with education. Informal education as well, work with the media and communication, and I think that if we were successful in some of these areas, it was for this reason, because we had these alliances. And to conclude, I should say that Ni Una Menos, not one woman less, was a success, but not because the Holy Ghost suddenly appeared. I don't want to get involved with people's religions. It was because of all of the work we have done. And I am speaking very clearly, I hope you'll forgive me. But at the very beginning, when we started waving this little flag, we were 4 mad women. And then we were able to sort of go to where the obelisk is, and the cars practically ran us over because there were so few of us. There was just one man with us, who was Carlos Jauri, who supported us, accompanied us in this fight, and that was all. And then in 2015, when I saw that same square full of people, I cried. That after so many people, I cried. That after so many years of fight, to see that. And you have to go on insisting and insisting and fighting and fighting. And you finally get what you're asking for in that way. And it wasn't simply for women, it was for Argentine families, because people ended up being mothers and spouses and daughters and sisters. So this is a fight that has to be fought. And women legislators have the responsibility of promulgating laws, but then after that, there is still the responsibility, and excuse me saying that the law is applied. A law isn't enough in itself, it has to be monitored, and you have to be very careful that the law is applied. And that's not an easy thing at all, but it is our function. And this function is so important, as important as passing laws in the first place. I would ask you to think about that, to bear that in mind, and to see that the anti-rights forces, which are arising again and which are going to want to put everything, lump everything together, and that's not the way things are meant to happen. We need fully to fight for full rights, from sexual education to abortion, including gender identity and many other things, and control of violence. Many, many thanks. Many thanks, Mabel. We still have 2 panelists, unless they wish to switch around, but there will be Veronica Barrett and then Natalia Gerardi. If they could be with us here. And it's true that women's fight has been and still is a necessity, as Mabel has said. No fight is won at no cost. We had to fight for many years, we had to demonstrate in many streets, we had to be present in many places in order to achieve what we have achieved. And there's still more to be achieved. I'd like now to present and to thank for being present Veronica Barrett. I'll just take a moment for her to get settled, because we had to change a few things around here. But it's also part of this need to listen to all women who have something to say about our rights. So I was saying that Veronica Barrett is the representative of UN Women. I thank her doubly because Veronica is also come from Montevideo to participate in this meeting and to share with us today. Veronica has the floor. Many thanks, Julia and Samir Rafaela, for inviting me to this panel. And I'll tell my last name is Barakat, and I'm Argentine. But the UN Women Representative Cecilia is from Uruguay, but I personally am here as an Argentine person. And Maria Beza, our regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean, is in Panama and is also sent her greetings because she cannot be here personally today on this panel. Today's world is more complex, and as we know, it's more important than ever before to promote more women participating in the construction of more volunteer-based and democratic societies. And this has to do with the role of women and protagonists in the construction of peace and making decisions which benefit the whole population. Public policy reflects the diversity of our societies and contributes to increasing trust in institutions. Unfortunately, when we see many of these meetings, very few women seem to participate in them. And UN women conferences tend to have much more lasting results in conferences where less women are present. So today we find ourselves dealing with a century-long agenda to try to have women's and children's rights respected in the world. However, in our region, we have economic and social situations in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is strongly marked by an increase in poverty and inequalities for everyone, but in particular for women, and particularly for indigenous, Afro-descendant, or rural women. In 2021, the CEPA report the ECLAC report presented for Latin America talked about the increased poverty of women concerning something like 5 million people, going from 81 million to 86 million people living in extreme poverty, largely because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Women's role in the labor market has fallen back to a level we saw 18 years ago, and we consider that only 50% of these jobs would need to be covered to go back to 2016's level, and we still have a difference of more than 20 points as against the employment rate that we see for men. So it's necessary to make a commitment for decent work for women, for better recovery from the pandemic. All of this impacts on women's autonomy. We see inequality in education, in work, and one of the main critical points we have here concerns exactly this inequality between genders. And when we see what is going on in this area, including fair distribution of work and the overload that is imposed upon women, given also to the impact of the pandemic, women are also taking greater risks for their physical autonomy, their sexual and reproductive rights throughout the region. In Latin America and the Caribbean, as you've already said, progress has been made. However, not enough progress has been made. Last year, the Generation Equality Forum was a meeting organized by the French and Mexican governments together with youth and civil society movements, and in that forum, $1 billion of financial commitments were undertaken, as well as many other political and program-based commitments. 5 years were set forth to have greater opportunity for leadership and equality for women and children in the world. The ambitious program of that forum talked about the need for interaction between governments and other interested parties to work together and bring about an action plan for the whole world to promote gender equality. And in this context, you also need to bring out the commitment of the Latin American and Caribbean Union concerning health and sexual and reproductive rights. This coalition, involving people from France and elsewhere, in the context of which we consider there should be agreement on action with concrete consequences for health and sexual and reproductive rights, including the access to free and safe abortion and sex education for women. In our coalition for the Foundation to Study and Research Women, where Mabel is active, the Commission for Children and Indigenous Women in Peru. We also wish to bring out the progress that has been made in Argentina in public policy to recognize the same sexual and reproductive rights of all women in all their diversity in Argentina, and we go on supporting the efforts that are being made in our national system to have a full care system. And to this end, we heard the opening session our Congress by the President talking about the draft law to establish a full care system in a gender perspective, and also talking about equal rights as an object of policy, including adoption and also aspects concerning self-employed people. In the same context, we're also talking about strengthening integral sex education for children and adolescents so that they can have tools to look after their bodies and their reproductive health, to be responsible and to deal responsibly with their peers, but in particular with women and with sexual diversity. But there's still a long way to go. We're working together so as to change a violence culture or a gender culture that's been normalized in our society. Restricted access to health for the exercise of one's sexual and reproductive rights is a key for women and children to make progress, even though we have seen progress on a normative level in terms of participation and visibility on the importance of gender equality and sustainability. Women's are a risk factor in the case of many millions of people. According to UNICEF, 15 million of adolescents 15 and younger have had forced sexual relations and other forced sexual acts throughout the world. The immense majority in countries, adolescents are the group with the highest risk of being raped or other forms of sexual abuse by their partners, their ex-partners, or in their family context. And following the data we have for 30 countries, we only have 1% of them requesting professional help. And so we need an articulated, integral focus for taking decisions, and this seems to be the most important, unavoidable aspect to arrive at a more fair and just society that leaves no one behind. Thank you very much. Thank you, Veronica Barrett, and please excuse me for my confusion when I introduced you. And then our last panelist will be Neraldi Gerardi, who is head of the Latin American Justice and Gender team. And she now has the floor. Many thanks. Thanks for the invitation and for the possibility of sharing a few thoughts coming from civil society in Argentina. My name is Untitled Chapter. I'm head of the ELA. It's an NGO based here in Buenos Aires. And I'm also a coordinator of various networks we have here. It's a sort of coalition or a network of professionals who work on access to abortion in different professions: health, law, social workers, and community action. So to talk a bit about being able to articulate things I've heard in previous speakers, it's always a benefit when you speak last. And let me just limit myself to a few short ideas. First of all, as was clearly mentioned already, the agenda for reproductive rights is part of a bigger agenda where many other things to do with autonomy have an important role to play. Effective possibilities of exercising physical autonomy, people being able to use their bodies as they will to be free of violence, also economic autonomy to have economic resources and actively participate in a country's economic life, and also to make decisions in the political, social, economic, or labor union spaces. And this all happens in an articulated way, and all these different dimensions of autonomy are important if we want to make progress in our gender equality agenda. And things that have been happening in the last 20 or 30 in Argentina have been important and interesting, as there has been recovering democracy, as Maria Luisa Mabel talked about some of the achievements of that return to democracy, and then which have accelerated with a very active and present women's movement, which is very diverse, and you see them demonstrating in the streets and elsewhere. but it's happened to happen in all different spaces. Argentina and other parts of Latin America, which are rich, diverse, and plural, because many different spaces exist. Youth, older people, but also institutions that we've mentioned, the Senate, both chambers of the Congress, and all of our provinces, and all of our media, in professions. There is a potential of spaces for power, and there still isn't enough of this. But there is enough, however, to be able to get our hands on some information and to keep the subject on the agenda, because before 2015 this was barely incipient. And it was because women did not yet have the space that we deserved on the public agenda. So if I'm focusing now on these issues, clearly legislation has been very favorably carried out, but implementation is still a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge in a very large country, a diverse, unequal country, which still leaves a large part of the population outside of their own rights. And this organization and others have brought together a meeting of lawyers specialized in women's rights and gender issues 2 or 3 days ago in Cordoba. More than 70 legal professionals from different provinces participated, and we were able to see during that dialogue between colleagues, both genders, the difficulty that is, how difficult it is to have access to abortion and to have that law properly implemented. There's a great lack of information, a lack of discussion on territorial level concerning the extent of the law, and I think this is mirrored also by confusion of what the legal reform actually meant. Legal reform in Argentina meant putting a term, originally 14 weeks, into the law during which you didn't have to say the reason for which people wished to interrupt, to have an abortion. And this is an intimate, private decision made by a woman, a child, an adolescent, sometimes accompanied by other persons, but it's always that person's decision. Then after 14 weeks, the difference is that you have to call upon some of the causes that were already in the legislation before and are still there, to say that there is danger for health because of sexual violence, and there is a certain confusion about these terms. And when we talk about health also, it's not always clear exactly what the law means. There are resources available for that, but sometimes to make this information available. And we see that this 14-week limit is put on as if the causes have then just disappeared from the law, and that's not the case. So there's a lot of work to be done to increase the flow of information throughout our society, but especially toward girls, teenagers, and women, so they may know what their rights are, and to know that it's better to act early for a bunch of reasons than for later. And we see this in especially many cases of sexual abuse, especially of girls and teenagers, that after 14 weeks of gestation, you still have these rights in exactly the same way they existed before. And this is a huge challenge, even more outside of big cities like Buenos Aires or Rosario, that have a tradition, if you will, a certain solidarity of public policy, which is very different than what we see in other places in Argentina. And then secondly, a part of this implementation, or these difficulties in implementation, also have to do with the weakness of public policy, but it is a state obligation. If civil society has a vocation and interest and work to be done in monitoring and to push certain actions, but the obligation to guarantee the efficiency and application of laws is of the state, at national level, at provincial level, and at municipal level. There is no excuse for the law not being applied. Argentina is a federal country, and there is provincial autonomy, and there are powers which are reserved to different levels, but the law, which is applied by the Congress, is obligatory for the whole country. Some of the tools we use for monitoring the respect of the law is to see how policies are designed, how they earmark public resources in national budgets, and how they then execute these budgets. Our organization, together with others, periodically monitors the execution of the national budget, because that, for some years ago, 4 or 5 years, let's say, has been presented with ever greater transparency and the way in which public resources are used. So when we're talking about transparency in use of resources, you have as a necessary precondition to that a proper budget so that it can be monitored afterward. And this has been going on at national level for 4 or 5 years. And most of the provinces have not got that far yet. So this, however, allows us to see how applicable laws are not always implemented, even when there is a budget for them. And the situation of women and of diversity, this is something new in government management, and it was fully carried out. In some cases, there was more than 100% respect of this. There are not, how can I say, this isn't mysterious. There are other places where we need to make progress in applying gender equality measures, but where the resources need to be fully used, fully spent. And what we see then is we have dedication to implementation and reinforcement of sexual and reproductive rights education, and where you see that the budgets are not being fully used. This is absolutely important information that's part of monitoring, and it has to be used to show where there is a failure by the government in compliance with relevant regulations. And it's not just about approving a law. Passing a law is much more than simply arriving at the point of a progress which is long and complex, of negotiations, which is very interesting, and where you arrive at solid results between women and people in general. But I'm emphasizing, let's say, women legislators, who often are the ones who push this agenda, but of course they have allies and colleagues who are very necessary. But that's not the final point at which we arrive. It's just an unimportant point in the process, which has to be followed up to make sure that these laws are complied with, that they are properly applied. And then when we look at projections for the following year, that's very important as well. And then to conclude, I would say that another important point is to monitor how opposition groups and activists who try to oppose compliance with these measures use many different tools, including misinformation, fake news, and media, or in social media, which are hard to deal with, but also sometimes in the courts in Argentina, in our region, so as to oppose the implementation of these laws. When you have the law on abortion, which was passed a bit more than a year ago, there have been more than 30 lawsuits brought in different jurisdictions in our country, which are in different ways trying to oppose the law being implemented. Up until now, none of those suits were successful, and none of them managed to actually put obstacles in the way of the law being applied. And from this way, we're very active in the Ministry of Health, and particularly in the part thereof which is responsible for sexual and reproductive rights. The Ministry of Women as well is working very closely as well to follow up on these measures, and the provinces as well. But civil society, opposition groups, we are also supporting these cases. We intervene as we can using different strategies and processes, and we're trying to work in a coordinated way so as to guarantee that the rights which have been hard won in the streets and in other ways are now expressed as legal norms become a true reality and be protected in all the different contexts possible. No battle is ever won forever. We all know that. We need to be very attentive and very organized so as to support those victories and defend them in all possible contexts. I'm very pleased that you have chosen this subject today so that I can talk to you a bit about this. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Natalia Gerardi. Now, before we open the floor to questions or comments, Samira Rafaela is going to just try to summarize.
Aquí estamos.
We're in an in-between phase.
Sí. Sí. Bueno,
So we will do the opposite, actually. So if anyone in the room would like to ask a question or comment or give input, please raise your hand. There's our colleague from the Dominican Republic, as well as someone here in the front row who's requested the floor.
sí, aquí también, mire.
Yes, and here as well.
¿Empiezo yo? Pensé que iba a empezar la...
Mara, por favor, sí.
Mara, can you hear me? Yes, it works. It works. How is everyone? I'm Marta Baudua. I'm a national parliamentarian here from Argentina. Now, based on the conversation that I have been having with Parla Team, Parla Sur, and the European Parliament, I wanted to just raise a point of concern, very much related to the establishment within Eurolat for a place to be able to raise issues of LGBTQI plus, and we know that there are groups that assist LGBTI plus communities that would help members of parliament or to raise their issues with members of parliament who are poised to assist them. And now we know that the situation in many countries is very different. There are some countries that are extremely well placed, for example, Argentina, and other countries where sexual identity, gender identity is still something that is criminalized or it can even lead to jail sentences. So we have to look at the certain conditions for those who are working for broadening of rights and for diversity. We need to look at the overarching view because we need to know that democracies are stronger with the empowerment of the more vulnerable communities, so women, children, people with disabilities, and the same can be said about the LGBTI plus community. So this was a proposal that has come up time and time again in my discussions with other members of parliament to have that special space for this, a formal working group potentially where we could look at the current situation and take stock. Many in our regions and are asking us to support them in their fight. And so we could do that in this way. Thank you. Thank you, Mara. Thank you for this proposal. And what we could do perhaps is request that you make a formal proposal to the Executive Bureau on this, and then we can work on it from there. Now, our Member of Parliament from the Dominican Republic. Thank you very much, Chair. Panelists, I'm the Vice President of Women, Youth, and Health, and so I would like to just send specific greetings from Parlacen, from all of those countries that compose Parlacen, and specifically from my country, the Dominican Republic. In the Central American Parliament, we have an approach to women and their situations, and we have a caucus also for women, and we look at gender equality. And every single individual in the Parliament is very careful and prudent in looking at issues related to women. Every time there's a subject, every single month, every single day, resolutions are tabled and sent out to our countries via the chancelleries and the Central American Parliament. Now, because we need to be able to look at those issues related to women, issues that relate to women also relate to families, and i.e. our entire society by extension. Now, as members of Parliament of the Central American Parliament, we have specific proposals to make to Eurolat, to the Women's Forum, because what we can see is we need to do even more than just have this Women's Forum that has been working for a number of years, but in addressing all subjects related to us as women, but families as well. And we understand that this should be something that should not just be a forum, but rather a standing committee in Eurolat. This proposal is there. We will continue to work on it. We will submit it to Eurolat via this forum that you chair, Madam. Please count on the unanimous support of the Central American Parliament and in every single proposal that we make as women, and again, as men too. I'd like to underscore the fact that in the Central American Women's Caucus, we have a number of men who are involved in that as well, and that support the acts that we are carrying out. They're assisting us in solidarity to pass the legislation and resolutions that we have, and to try to make them all the more tangible. Thank you, and a good afternoon to one and all.
Silvia Polanco.
Thank you very much, Silvia Blanco. Truth be told, the forum, yes, should be a standing committee here in Eurolat. This would be our objective indeed, and we will take your proposal and please, yes, bring it to the Executive Bureau such that we can work on it directly. Now, someone else was requesting the floor. I believe someone here in the front row that was requesting the floor. Please be brief. Last person who's requested the floor this afternoon. Thank you. Thank you very much. Congratulations for this excellent initiative. Julia, thank you for the invitation. Patricia Petruga, and I'm a representative of a civil society organization that is to bring nations together. And I wear a double hat, and I work on gender issues and have been doing so for a long time. Now, there are some key words really. Impact. We can't ask just politicians. We can't ask everything of our politicians. This is something that comes down to our families. Many issues need to be resolved, and I think that we need to work on that in a more connected approach with the press. Your senior spoke as a journalist and as a politician, and I think it's important to work on the political agenda and a mechanism that I believe that could be very nimble and effective for doing this is culture. Moreover, we are working on an international festival for diversity Maya that you are going to hear about because it's going to be an international festival. It'll be in Buenos Aires and in other sites, and we're going to give an embodiment to these proposals in the Women Economic Forest as well. And there's more space to give more visibility and a connected approach to this. And this cannot just be something that comes down to one sector. So this is what our organization is aiming to do, to bring all of these forces together and to work with press, those who are coming up with content. You know, much work can be done, I think, on this side and there. There's a lot of ignorance out there, and that's something that needs to be fought. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Patricia.
Thank you, Patricia. Now, I should like to give the floor to our co-president, Samira Rafaela, who is going to give us a summary conclusion of the debate. There's been much work done this afternoon and excellent contributions from our panelists, and she will now summarize. Thank you. In May 2021, we had our last meeting. We chose the next subject topic for the Women's Forum, the role of women in the economy and in global trade, and gender in the free trade agreement between Chile and Uruguay, and the modernization of the association agreement that is set to take place between the EU and Chile.
Okay. Shall I do that again? Okay. En la última reunión de...
In May 2021, we had our previous meeting of the forum, and we set the topic for the next Women's Forum to look at the role of women in the economy and in global trade. Then there was gender chapters in the free trade agreement between Chile and Uruguay, as well as the updating that is set for the association agreement between the EU and Chile, and the vital role that women can carry out in the role that that agreement can play in empowering women in the global economy. And the European co-presidency is committed to addressing this issue in the next forum meeting, and I would agree with this proposal. Would you agree with this proposal, or is there another proposal that one would like to make?
Perdón, Samira.
Samira, I apologize. The idea is that what the members of parliament raised were topics based on subjects that can be addressed in the next forum. So if you would like to add to that or add any other subject matter, we can see if we can bring it together. For example, Mara Brouwer and Silvia Blanco also raised specific issues, and maybe they would like to say something more. And the member from the Parliament of Curaçao, there's a surprise for her. It would be unfortunate for her to leave too early. I hope she'll stay, because then she'll miss their surprise otherwise. Would anyone like to propose anything else? Would you agree with the topics that Samira put forth, and then what we can do is include in that also the other proposals that were made by the two members of parliament?
Sí, perfecto.
Perfect, excellent. Samira?
Lo que propone María Luisa.
Maria Luisa was proposing that Mara Brouwer made a proposal, and she suggested that everyone would sign her proposal so that we could then work on that. Okay, good. We'll work on that. Apologies. I would have one further proposal to make. Two more things that were said in the forum, and also to really congratulate you, Julia, and the other members. Last year, we made a proposal in the Chamber of Deputies, a draft bill linked to press. Natalia was saying that disinformation on laws, and a colleague also commented on this. There is a central point in terms of sexual crime. What we see is that the major complaint that victims have is the way they're treated in press, re-victimization because of the press treatment. So it seems to me that it would be important for our parliament, our assembly here, Eurolat, to integrate the issue of press and issues related to gender, as well as the treatment and that is given to gender. Because what we can see is that there are a lot of people that are really concerned about hate speech and gender ideology. That's very much related to the press. So it seems to me that the committee, not the forum, but the forum that should become a committee, would also have that item on the agenda that would be related to press. Thank you, Maria Rosa. This is a good contribution, I think, to have the press and the gender perspective. So more work than for our women's group that are worried and at the same time committed to coming up with good responses here through Eurolat. Samira, if you don't have anything else that you'd like to say at this time, then I would just thank everyone. Thank all of the panelists. Please don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. all of those who worked to make this meeting possible, the forum. So the group from the Argentine Senate, and as well, Francisca, it's your birthday. Don't go away.